Welcome to It's a Woman's World, a show that discusses all topics from a woman's point of view. We believe all women should be treated with respect at all times and in all places. Hello and welcome to It's a Woman's World. My name is Beverly Crosby and I'm going to be your host today. A few years back, I had the privilege of working on a documentary with an amazing group of Minnesota women. They were part of an international group called WILF, Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. Women would gather from around the world, sharing their struggles, their issues, concerns, and their accomplishments. Well, this group of women came back from a conference and they gathered together wondering how they could tell all these stories. And they decided to use the arts. Arts being poetry, music, theater. So today, what we're going to do is revisit the documentary. And we're going to see how the WILF organization began. We're going to hear about some of the women's concerns from around the world. And we're going to see how the Arts Committee used art to tell those stories. One more thing I'd like to do before we start watching the film is I'd like to honor someone who is no longer with us. Her name is Marilyn Cuneo. Marilyn has passed away since the documentary has been made. She was a very instrumental part of organizing the Arts Committee and very active in the WILF organization along with many other community endeavors. Thank you to her family for letting us show this film with Marilyn in it. We definitely want to honor her. And with that said, let's take a look.
So Jane Addams founded the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILF, as it's fondly called, in 1915. And we have the privilege of having Jane here tonight to talk to us and tell us the story of the founding of WILF.
I welcome you to the celebration, our 100th anniversary of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It is the longest living women's peace organization in the world. I'm Jane Addams, one of the founders of WILF. And thank you for coming to visit our exhibit of the Arts Committee of the Metro Branch. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my own personal movement from social service to becoming a social reformer and a peace activist. My peace work started in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and I had joined the anti-imperialism league that was organized that year. I hated the racism and the false patriotism that was present. I gave lectures for the Carnegie Peace Foundation and at the University of Wisconsin, and I wrote The Newer Ideals of Peace. As you may know, that about 10 years earlier, in 1889, I had founded the first settlement house in Chicago called the Hall House. It was for all the immigrants that were coming to the inner cities. And I had witnessed how, no matter where these men and women came from in the world, that they shared a common humanity. I want you to know that I was just a piece of the story about WILF's founding. There were many thousands of women, of course, all sharing the common goal of a just and peaceful world. We founded WILF in April 1915 at a meeting of women, and World War I had begun less than a year earlier in August 1914. And our meeting was called by the leader of the Dutch section of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, and her name was Alida Jacobs. The International Suffrage Alliance had actually planned for their annual meeting in Berlin in this year of 1915, but because of the war, World War I, were not able to do that. So Alida Jacobs decided that she was going to plan an alternative meeting, and she started calling women from different countries to come together to discuss a plan for mediation to end World War I, and to actually, the goal was to end all war. 1,136 women came to the Hague Congress from 12 nations. There were Americans, Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, English, Scottish, Belgians, Italians, Danes, Norwegians, and Dutch. And 150 organizations were represented. There were also hundreds of messages sent from India and Brazil, Spain, Poland, Serbia, Russia, and South Africa. And the press, well, they called us foolish women to even think that women could have anything to say about world affairs. When I started to work to make some changes, some social reform, and to work for peace, I was called the most dangerous woman in America. Yes, I was placed on the list of who's who of radicals and pacifists. Foolish women, no. Courageous women, yes. Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was much social reform happening. The Industrial Revolution had concentrated wealth and exploited workers. And immigration was at an all-time high. It was a time of progressive thought and action. Marx and Tolstoy and many others were speaking for the masses. Settlement houses and other reform institutions were active. Many social reform movements were based on secular and humanitarian ideals and not just on moral or religious zeal. And women had really come to realize that peace and suffrage were inseparable, and we knew that there was no peace without justice. At the end of our 4-day meeting, we passed 20 resolutions, and 3 of the most important ones were to have continuous mediation until the war could be ended. And the second one was that women needed to have a voice in the settlement for peace. And the third one was that we send envoys right now to all of the neutral leaders and to the warring leaders with our resolutions. Alida Jacobs, who had called our meeting, and we headed the team to travel to the warring countries, which were Austro-Hungary, Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and we even met with the Pope. And then in August, we met with President Wilson in the United States. The second team of delegates visited the Scandinavian countries and Russia, and together we made 35 visits to 14 nations. This was during the middle of the war. And although no mediation was set up or done, our vision did influence international relations for the rest of the century. Also, our 20 resolutions were clearly in the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson wrote for the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, although it really did not work out very well, it did set a precedent for setting up the United Nations and eventually the Declaration of Human Rights. But at the end of our Congress, we knew we had a clear channel to work for peace, and we named it the International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace. Later, of course, named the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at the end of the war. So following the Hague Congress, our next task was to consolidate all these relationships that we had set up and to plan for this Congress at the end of the war. We met in Zurich, Switzerland, in May of 1919. And there we had women from 16 countries. But the mood was really somber and pessimistic, as you might imagine. At the Congress, women from the opposing countries reached out to one another, and we resumed our work. We established our headquarters in Geneva, where the League of Nations was to be. So we continued our work into the 1920s, protesting the food blockage to Germany and Russia and the deportation of political dissenters and immigrants from the United States. The mood had really turned in our country. And we worked to return prisoners of war and we kept working to revise the Versailles Treaty and to promote universal disarmament. So in looking back over these 100 years of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, we can see that there are three themes that stand out. And the primary one has always been a commitment to ending violence against women, from the personal to the global violence, and recognizing all the different kinds of violence, whether it's psychological, economic, political, or personal. Secondly, WILF has always believed that one of the women's primary responsibilities is to see that children are protected. And third, WILF believes only through the rights of citizenship can women make an impact as peacemakers. So we need the full range of our citizenship rights. But what I've shared is only just a beginning little piece of the 100-year story. And its story continues today, though, on 7 continents and in 37 countries. It's a global network of local grassroots activists. And WILF remains a women's organization with women working with women all over the world.
United Nations documents have been really important to us at the WILF Arts Committee. The first document was the Declaration of Human Rights. They got together to start that in 1945 and signed the declaration in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt was an important part of that, and she was insistent that it read human rights for men and women, not just men. And they said, well, men are included, that's an inclusive word. And she said, no, only when men want it to be inclusive. The women were not included in the Constitution in the United States. It took us a long time to get our rights, and she wanted them into that declaration. Women's role, for a long time, they dealt with legal kinds of things.
The number of female deputies to the National People's Congress had increased to 626 in the 8th National People's Congress in 1993 from 147 in 1954 when the first National People's Congress opened.
Increasingly, with the advent of the contemporary feminist movement, the role of women in developing countries as well as in the Western countries became more apparent.
They are enjoying equal pay for equal work. Women in rural areas are turning out more than half of the country's agricultural production.
1975 was declared the International Women's Year. And here in Minnesota, we celebrated that with a big coalition of women's groups. And we did a day at the state fair so that we could include women from all over the state. Soon, of course, we realized that that wasn't sufficient. And the 1 year before it was over became International Women's Decade. And big groups of women began to form. In the early years, they were working on what are the problems, or what came to be called the areas of concern. Eventually, this led to the meetings in Beijing, China. And the document that would come out of there was called the Platform for Action. In Nairobi in '85, they began to solidify what the areas of concern were. But in Beijing, they wanted to talk about what actions can take place. How can we make the changes? The process is one where government and non-government organizations, or what we'd call nonprofits in the West, are all talking about these issues. The documents from Nairobi grew and people kept talking about them. And so the people who care the most about these issues are all gathering around the world to discuss them and to hone this into what would become the outcome of Beijing. We formed a big coalition of the major women's organizations here in Minnesota, and it was called Minnesota Women's Coalition Action Agenda. And we talked about those 12 planks that would become the Platform for Action. One of the women in that group, our longtime convener, Marilyn Cuneo, noticed that with all of these different issues, nobody was discussing the arts. And she said, what about the arts? What is art's role in social change? And there were a number of people who agreed with her. Marilyn, you've been our convener now for almost 20 years. 20 years. Mm-hmm. And when you looked at those early documents at the countdown to Beijing, and you saw that there wasn't any mention of arts, would you tell us about that story?
It was interesting because there were so many people there. There was the big crowds that came from Minnesota, many women interested in going there. They were discussing and trying to find out more information about the various parts of the conference that would eventually turn out to be the Platform for Action, all the different kinds of worries and problems that women around the world have. It occurred to many people that there was no talk about the arts and what the part that women play in the arts, and the necessity to emphasize that, actually, so that the world will realize that women are artists, and that they believe and feel in their hearts that that is the best way to communicate with people, and that it itself is a language that reaches the inner parts of your body, your heart, and it's not all mind and words. And so there were enough people that came together. We didn't know each other, it just happened. So much of this work is happening. But it did wake people up. People began to want to meet and talk about this as an arts committee. So WILF provided that in a way. The woman who was running the office at the time, who was really very enthusiastic about the thing, she asked me if I would convene this group. And So I said, innocently said, oh yes, of course I will do that. They can all come over to my house. So that's what happened. And we began meeting, and quite a few women came to these meetings.
And I went down to that meeting, and it was Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, kind of getting people acquainted with the idea of this peace training project that was going to happen. It also had parts of the document of the 4th UN Conference on Women that were in preliminary state. And so there was working groups that went on and went into different sections of the document to give some input into them. So I found that meeting was absolutely inspiring, and decided I've got to go, come hither or whatever.
Countdown to Beijing did many different things, including monthly meetings, and we had a big conference actually, and to discuss the issues. So we had input before the conference in Beijing. We had input into the things we thought were important.
We became friends, we knew each other, we found we had like ideas, and the best part of the people who stayed is that they're so enthusiastic and so willing to try anything. So that's been so much fun, but at the same time that we've been doing serious business, as you can see as you walk around here.
This fledgling arts committee did a number of things as well, and Diane Knutz is a quilter as well as a social worker, and she decided to put out a call for quilt squares. In addition, some school teachers called her and wanted to get children involved. The quilts would eventually be distributed on the peace train throughout the former Soviet bloc. There was another call, and that call was for poetry. And we printed 10,000 bookmarks with poems by Minnesota women on them.
Well, one day I was talking with a friend, and she mentioned this peace organization, which I had never heard of before. It happened to be Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And her name is Dixie. Dixie knew that I love to travel. So she mentioned the fact that this organization would be going to Beijing, China. And I said, oh, I sure would like to go. I sure would like to go. So, knowing I didn't have the money, I thought, well, how am I going to go? But she mentioned the fact that they were offering a scholarship for the person who would come up with the best idea where women as a whole would benefit from this conference. So I submitted the proposal, and my idea was for women to be able to express themselves with their pen and paper. And the reason why I said that is because there would be at least 30,000 women. Everybody would not have a voice that is verbally to speak about these women issues that would go before the platform for action, which were about women and girls. So as I said, they could certainly write about it. So I presented that in my proposal, and sure enough, I got the scholarship. So how we got the points for the book? Well, we sent out a call for women to submit poems for this project. We collected poems on the peace train, gave poetry workshops on the peace train and in Beijing, Maryland and I. So after getting all those and getting back home, there were many, many poems waiting for us.
Women were invited to say what they thought the concerns were and what their roles as women were like in their countries. That book eventually had almost 200 poems and 17 languages and 5 alphabets. The end result of all this organizing from Countdown Beijing was that Minnesota had over 200 people in our delegation to the United Nations Conference in Beijing. We had the biggest state delegation present. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom had organized a big biennial international conference in Helsinki, Finland. And then they organized a peace train. That's an old peace tradition to organize a peace train and have stops like the old presidential campaign stops. And so they had organized to take a peace train from Helsinki all the way to Beijing, going through the former Soviet bloc countries.
We boarded the train in St. Petersburg, and it stopped 13 times in various cities along the way. We met in each place with a local women's organization that that country designated and other officials, and the topic centered around gender rights or women's rights in their country. And then we went to Moscow and caught the train that took us to the border of China, and then we talked. In China we changed again, as I said, outside of Hairu, and took a Chinese train that took us through the Golgi Desert and all the way over to Beijing.
When we came home from Beijing, it was really important to tell the stories of global women, and then and to get out the message of the Platform for Action. There were 5,000 Japanese women in Beijing, and they often, because of the language barrier, they often did parades, and these women were marching, protesting nuclear war. We met these Malaysian women on the bus on the way to the opening ceremony. They were college trained in the U.S., and they said to us, our dilemma is we don't know how much we dare teach our young women, that some of the things we want to teach them might cost them their lives. There were 30,000 people at the NGO conference, thousands of workshops. There was so much going on, and people trying to translate what was happening at the official government conference. And then it was the 50th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and we put out that call, and we said we wanted to tell the stories of global women who had experienced abuse of their human rights and who had survived. We wanted to focus on telling the stories of survivors.
That's what our purpose is,
Right.
really, is to bring these things that we learn and know about through our connections with the world.
Hello again. I hope you enjoyed watching this film, and it brought about some awareness of how the WILF organization had to overcome so many challenges for women's rights. Next time, we will invite one of the co-founders of this arts committee to join us and to talk specifically about how all their work and their efforts has affected the women here in the United States, and especially here in Minnesota. So with that, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on It's a Woman's World. Thank you.